Sounds like there's going to be plenty of twang in the new year if Whitehorse have anything to say about it. Whitehorse is the Canadian couple Melissa McClelland and Luke Doucet, and their new album, I'm Not Crying, You're Crying, is due out on January 13th. Here they are now in Winnipeg, Canada, to give us some insight on the new record.
It's called I'm Not Crying, You're Crying, and it was written at the very beginning of the pandemic, and so we've just been kind of sitting on it, and we started playing some of the songs live, but yeah, it officially comes out in January.
Okay, I've had a good listen to it, and I know there's a video of the first track, If the Loneliness Don't Kill Me, so it would make sense to talk about that one first. What can you tell me about the song?
I've been looking for you, stranger. I've been looking for you, friend. I've been wandering the streets in my dreams again. I've been breathing in the same air. I'll be breathing out and still. If the loneliness don't kill me, then the good times surely will.
You know, we've been, pretty much on the road full time our whole adult lives. And, so when we went into lockdown, it was a drastic change of pace for us. And, we knew that we wanted to start working on another record. And, John Prine had just passed away from COVID, and that hit pretty hard. And, Luke started diving into all this country music, mostly 70s country, Graham and Emmylou, George Jones, Tammy Wynette, John Prine. I don't know if there's anyone you'd want to add to that list.
But I could go, like for me, like Willie Nelson and Chris Christopherson, and like the outlaw country stuff.
Yep.
Yeah. So that was just like floating through our house at all times, and then Luke would stay up late in the kitchen with a bottle of wine and a guitar, and he just started writing all these country songs. And at some point, I kind of looked at him, and I'm like, "Well, I better catch up. I need to get on it." And this was maybe his way of dealing with the change in our life. And thematically, there's a lot going on in the songs about lockdown and that shift. So the next day, I was sitting on our front porch with my guitar, and that line, "If the loneliness don't kill me, the good times surely will." And the song just kind of grew out of that. So that was my first contribution to the record.
I mean, it was a bit of if I remember correctly, it was a bit of a tribute to our recycling bin.
Totally.
Because it was full of wine bottles, and it's like,
right.
If being isolated from other humans doesn't hit me in, the wine I'm drinking probably will.
Yeah.
And that's like that would be the literal
Gotcha.
iteration of that song.
Yeah.
And that theme. I mean, the thing about lockdown and the pandemic is that classic country themes of loneliness and existential angst, like what's the world for?
Right.
My brain was just full of that. Our brains, I think, were full of that for years. So it was strangely conducive to writing country songs.
Yeah, well, I was just in Nashville I'd gone there for the first time ever a couple of weeks ago for the Americana Fest. And it definitely felt that the ghost of John Prine was everywhere there. So he made quite an impression on everyone. And of course, his label seems to be doing very well. So what is it about John Prine's music and his essence that kind of had such a big effect on you guys?
I mean, he managed to do a whole bunch of things simultaneously. That was like he wrote. I don't know. He was funny. And not all of us are funny,
right?
And he was dirty, and like it's to be funny and dirty, and also a beautiful poet. Even that alone, like that's a trifecta of majesty that we don't. Sometimes you have two of those things, or sometimes even just one will suffice. But he had a lot. He had a lot going on. There was a lot of empathy and sort of pathos in his music, and at the same time, he didn't take himself too seriously. I don't know. I mean,
yep.
I mean, obviously there are others who seem to have those gifts, but
yep,
he was also kind of folksy and approachable in his own way. Like he didn't seem to take on big airs in order. Like I'm a big Tom Waits fan, but Tom Waits just enshrouded himself in mystery and character, in he was playing characters. Everything about his career was one great big like charade, which is fantastic. What a fantastic thing he did. But then,
Right.
I think John Prine's almost the antithesis, where he just seems so sincere and genuine, and yeah.
He was also one of the elders of the Americana world, and we've been talking a lot about that genre and the difference between country music and Americana, right. And I feel like back then, maybe in the 60s or 70s, though, it was all one. It was all one genre, and over time, it's really separated. And I think it has separated kind of the true storytellers, the true grit, the humor, the being rough around the edges, or a little more folksy, or
right.
And I think that is what differentiates Americana from country. And I think maybe John Prine is one of the
right.
The prime examples of
right.
Those things that Melissa's talking about are all luxuries that you can afford when you're not encumbered by the responsibility of having to follow up your last hit. Because country artists have hits. Americana artists kind of like, well, maybe we do, or maybe we don't, or maybe we used to. Like you think about, even Johnny Cash, Willie Nelson, Emily Harris, people that were all pulled into the Americana tent over the years, or blues artists. Like some of the greatest blues artists of all time are now widely regarded as part of under the Americana tent. I think Buddy Guy was recently honored and stuff. So
gotcha.
That's cool. Like on one hand, it's like, isn't that great that it's a big tent finally, and that there's a spirit of community that exists outside of limiting parameters of musical style. Like, well, you have to be bluegrass, or you have to be like, red dirt country, or whatever. There's room for a lot. It is a big tent, and I think that's one of the most welcome things about the burgeoning Americana scene is that it's a big tent. But it's also, there are jokes to be made there. It's like, well, Americana is just country music for people without hits.
I don't know. Steve Earle had hits. Like had hits. Yeah.
Steve Earle had hits.
Right.
Yeah. Well, the first band that I saw at Americana Fest was an English band called the Heavy Heavy. So they had very little twang going on, but they still kind of fit in somehow. So there you go.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Now I see you have a song called Division 5, which kind of, speaking of John Prine, kind of has a bit of his whimsy about the lyric and all that. Do you care to share a little bit about how that song came about?
I went down to Division 5, local RCMP, to file a missing persons report. Well, they looked me up and down, then their eyes went to the ground. They burst out laughing, and they showed me the door. I showed the officer my tears and said I ain't seen her in years. And he said, son, do you know where it is she's at? I said, I'm pretty sure I do, at least the province and the town. But she swears that she ain't never coming back. And he said, brother, that's the deal. Sometimes it's over and done for real. There ain't a goddamn thing the Mounties can do.
I'm Not Crying, You're Crying. It's these are classic tales of loneliness and unrequited love, and yet here we are, a married couple of 16 years. We've been together for almost 20 years. And so we sort of have to, we took on characters ourselves, and we went out into the world with alter egos, with our proverbial masks and capes, and we collected stories. And in this particular story, and I'm not going to divulge how much of it's autobiographical or how much is something I've stolen from other people's lives that I've observed, but nonetheless, boy meets girl, things go south. He gets sad. He's so sad, in fact, that he goes into the local police station and he, fills out a missing persons report, but on himself, because he's so lost. And what he's not expecting is that one of the cops is a country singer, and the cop pulls out a guitar and sings him a country song, basically telling him not to be so pathetic. And and that's all. But it was interesting when I finished that song. Shauna at our record label, Melissa heard it, she liked it, and Shauna loved it too. But it was an interesting time because it was in the aftermath of George Floyd and the protests and the unrest, particularly in America, but not only in America. And there was at one point I was like, am I allowed to write a song that humanizes the police right now? I don't know if I'm allowed to do that.
Right. You know?
Yeah. And that we actually had to have that conversation. Because like I'm writing a song, it's sort of like paints this cop as a guy who, you know, who pulls me aside and goes, hey, buddy, everything's going to be okay. And he sings my folksy little country song. I mean, imagine that something that anodyne could be controversial, but here we are in 2022.
Everything seems to be controversial. Everybody's going to get offended by something, it feels like. So you just kind of got to go for it, I guess.
Yeah.
So what were the recording environment like for you for making this record? Were you in a studio? Were you working at home? Did you have a lot of people working with you, or is it more isolated than that?
Yeah, it was in a studio in Toronto that we've worked at a bunch of times. But it was really our first outing out of the house. Like we hadn't been anywhere. I think we maybe recorded it for 4 or 5 months after the initial lockdown. And lockdown was pretty serious in Toronto. Actually, it was where you are as well. So, you know, we went into the studio and everybody's masked and you have to, you know, do a test and fill out forms and get your temperature taken. And, you know, it's like this strange new world. And especially in the environment of making music where it's so, I don't know, it's like an exorcism sometimes because you're just like in there, like sweat and blood and tears and everybody's putting everything into it. And so it was just such a strange environment to walk in. And it just feels like you're kind of like closed off from everyone else. But, you know, once we were in the studio and actually making the music, it just felt so great. And we had our drummer, Johnny, and a pedal steel player, Burke Carroll, both Toronto guys and good pals. And it was really just us in the studio, and we kind of recorded everything live off the floor. And then afterwards, of course, took more time with vocals and guitars and that kind of thing. But we really wanted it to feel like, you know, making music, especially with this style of music and playing. It should be as natural as possible, I think.
I was imagining that, like, whenever we were getting songs on feet, we just arranged them as if we were playing a show.
Right.
Like, what would we? You know, we kind of arranged the songs the way you like get ready to play a show, and then we would just play them a bunch, drums and pedal steel live off the floor together, and we would get, you know, we do 5 or 6 passes usually to a click track, so we'd be able to move stuff around. Like, oh, that pedal steel pass was better on that pass, we'll move it over. So we did a little bit of that, but ultimately the point was we wanted this record to sound like 4 people. 5 people on stage together. So there's no overdubs of percussion or keyboards or lots of backup vocals. Like Melissa and I would each sing our main part together. And I think there's maybe 2 songs on the record where we snuck in a third vocal, you know, but we were reluctant because we was like, well, we want it to sound like these people and that's it. And which it really mostly does. Right. Yeah. But it was, I think we sort of imagined ourselves, even though we were in a downtown studio in Toronto, we kind of imagined, like, what if we were at Big Pink? Right. You know? And that would be an ideal kind of record. Like, let's just go in with these people into a place in the forest somewhere and spend 10 days. And so we basically emulated that, but in a studio downtown.
Gotcha. Well, you don't think of Toronto as having a lot of country musicians play. I moved to Auckland from Rochester, New York, which is just on the other side of Lake Ontario from Toronto. I've been there a few times, but not for country music. Yeah. So that's interesting that you can do that. Yeah.
Yeah. There is surprisingly a lot of country music in Toronto. I remember my friend from Hawaii was visiting with her band, and a few of her friends from Hawaii, and it was all of them. And I took them out around Toronto. We went to all these little bars. I don't know, like some classic bars like the Dakota and Communist Daughter. And they said to me at the end of the night, they're like, wow, there's so much country music. Like, what? They didn't understand. And it really is. I mean, I don't think it's big in the industry in Toronto, in the Toronto scene, though. In the small bars, the Cameron House and places like that, there are always little country bands playing, and all like young people just digging into country music. So it definitely has a place in in Toronto. Surprisingly, you wouldn't think that.
I mean, I think that so there's a pretty pronounced legacy, and it goes all the way back to probably to Gordon Lightfoot, or the band Gordon Lightfoot. Now I know these are not necessarily country artists per se, but I think I suspect when you say country, you mean what we mean, which is Insurgent or Red Dirt or No Depression or alternative or Americana or something like that. Because you're right, there's not a lot of slick mainstream country coming out of Toronto, really not at all. But to Melissa's point, at the ground level, so it's so much of what you hear coming out of small bars is Telecasters and twangy stuff and roots singer songwriters. But you think about the legacy of a band like Blue Rodeo and the impact that they've had on I'm not sure how familiar you are, probably fairly familiar. You were probably vulnerable to the CBC airwaves in Rochester. Mm-hmm. So yeah, I mean the Sky Diggers are they loom large over the Toronto, a certain generation of Toronto artists, and there's a lot of good sort of rootsy sort of. I was talking to somebody at backstage at a show. I think he was from New York City, and he was an R&B artist. This black guy. He was from. I think he from. I think he said he was from Brooklyn. But in any case, he said, "Wow, there's a lot of country music up here."
Yeah, and
I was like, "Really?" Because I mean, I guess kind of, but for an American to come to Toronto, now obviously, if he's in the R&B hip hop scene from Brooklyn, that's a whole different world. But it's funny, that there is this idea that Canada is sort of dripping in folk and roots and Americana stuff, and some of the history suggests that and really reinforces it. The band, like Neil Young and that whole deal, Joni Mitchell, Katie Lang.
Yep. Exactly. Now, speaking of country music, doesn't get much more country than Patsy Cline, who I felt the spirit in a tune called Sanity, Tennessee. And then I did a little research because I wanted to find out if there really was a Sanity, Tennessee, and it turns out there's a heavy metal band called Sanity, Tennessee. Yeah, you were.
I heard someone else told us that in an interview, and we had no idea. So we got to check them out. It's funny because when I wrote that song, I didn't have Tennessee at the end of that line. It was just it's a long way back to Sanity, and I played it for Luke, and Luke said, "It needs to be a place." And I'm like, "Oh, that's interesting. Okay." And then I can't remember. We must have thrown around a few ideas, but yeah, Sanity, Tennessee is what we landed on.
I remember at one point, because I think I came up with the idea of Sanity, Tennessee, and you jumped on it right away. And you're like, "Yeah, that's the thing." I was like, "Okay, cool." And then later on, I was like, "Is it cliche that it's in Tennessee? Like, is it a little bit Toronto quasi country artist trying to be legit? Therefore, they drop Tennessee into one of their songs. What if it's Ohio?" And you were like, "It's not Ohio. It's dead against Ohio.
Tennessee."
That's great. And
but
I think the metal
I love that there's a metal
called
band
Sanity as well.
Yeah.
Well, maybe they should cover our song.
You guys could do a bill together.
That would be amazing.
I think you should perform together on the same set. That'd be awesome. Blow everybody's mind. So when the record comes out, what's the plan? Are you going to hit the road, or does it feel like things are getting back to normal for you guys?
We're going to go back out on the road. The record's going to come out in January. We're going to start touring very soon thereafter. The record's going to go through the roof and sell 30 million records. We're going to become like basically the next Florida Georgia line, and the rest is history. Like it's going to explode like crazy.
sounds about right.
Yeah.
That's the plan.
And all our heroes are going to want to open for us, like Tyler Childers and Margot Price. They're going to come knocking, and Trey Burt's going to want to come out and cameo on some songs. It's going to be great. It's going to be great.
Fantastic.
We have an excellent, solid plan.
Yeah, I like a good plan. Very good. Well, come down to this part of the world if you ever get a chance. We'd love to see you.
Absolutely.
Yes.
Absolutely. We did spend some time. We were in Auckland we were in New Zealand for a month or so many years ago when we were because sometimes we play in Sarah McLachlan's band, and we were getting ready for a global tour that was going to start in New Zealand and Australia. And she just decided, let's camp out in Auckland for 2 weeks and rehearse. So we spent 2 weeks rehearsing in New Zealand. It was fantastic. And then we did a bunch of shows. But so we have been, but we haven't been as Whitehorse.
Yeah, it's been a long time. Yeah, we got to come back and play as Whitehorse.
All righty. Well, good luck with the release. Thanks for spending so much time talking to me. Yeah. Bye-bye.
Thank you. You too.
Thanks, Marty.
Take care.
Take
Bye.
care.